Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for being here. My name's Joe Ferrara. I'm Vice President, Chief of Staff here at Georgetown University. And on behalf of the Office of the President and President DeJoy, I'd like to welcome everyone here tonight. We're gathered this evening for what I know will be a very interesting panel discussion hosted by our Free Speech Project here at Georgetown University and the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. I would also like to thank the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation and the Press Freedom Defense Fund for their sponsorship of tonight's program. We're very grateful for the opportunity to host a special joint forum here tonight in Gaston Hall. Before the discussion begins, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the important work of the Free Speech Project here at Georgetown. The Free Speech Project's work could not be more timely or relevant. At a moment when topics of civility, inclusiveness, and free speech are being debated in communities across this nation, the project is deepening our understanding of the condition of free speech in America, in higher education, in civil society, and in our state and local governments. And the Free Speech Project is also very focused on the health of an independent media and the media's ongoing capacity to help us as citizens understand what the government is doing and how it is conducting the public business. I'd like to express my gratitude to Director Sandy Unger and his team at the Free Speech Project for their efforts to help all of us better understand these issues. And I think tonight's forum will be an excellent example of how the Free Speech Project is doing that. It's hard to think of someone more qualified to lead this work than Sandy. Over his entire career, Sandy Unger has worked at the intersection of education, media, communications, and free speech. I'd also like to thank our panelists this evening. We look forward to your conversation and the insights that you will share in tonight's dialogue. So thank you all again for being here tonight, and I'm now going to turn things over to Sandy Unger to get the program started. Thank you.
Good evening. We'll get underway in just a moment. In addition to those that Joe graciously thanked just now, I also want to mention we have two campus sponsors this evening. One is the Lecture Fund, which has helped us get ourselves organized this evening, and also the Hoya, Georgetown student newspaper, which we're very proud of on campus. A few words before we get underway with our discussion from Kate Myers, who is Deputy Director of the Press Freedom Defense Fund. Kate?
Thank you, Sandy, and thank you all for coming out this evening for this incredible program, despite the rain. My name is Kate Myers, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Press Freedom Defense Fund and the Executive Director of our parent nonprofit, First Look Media Works. We're proud to join our partners here at the Free Speech Project at Georgetown University, the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University, and the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation as sponsors of this discussion. The Press Freedom Defense Fund stands up for the courageous journalists, documentarians, sources, and whistleblowers who are facing legal threats for revealing truth that the public needs to know. In particular, we focus on protecting the free flow of information from source to reporter, critical for the act of journalism. Without these courageous sources of information, the world would not know of the NSA surveillance activities which have snared United States citizens, the first uses of drones in warfare in Afghanistan in the fall of 2001, or the truth about our military's actions in wars from Vietnam to Iraq. In the business world, the value of strong sources is illustrated by the recent stories concerning Google's development of a censored search engine for the Chinese market. If the public does not have this information, our democracy and our society are at risk. Voters cannot hold their leaders' feet to the fire, advocate for these changes in policies and regulations, or fight for accountability by private companies unless this information is freely available to the world. The Press Freedom Defense Fund is proud to stand with our partners here in support of those pushing these truths out into the public. Thank you very much, and I'm now happy to welcome Sandy back up to the stage to begin this important discussion.
I'm not going to provide elaborate introductions. I think the programs tell you who our distinguished panelists are this evening. We're very proud to have them. And of course, Gaston Hall is always a great place to have important conversations. And glad to be doing it here. I think we'll get right into the substance of what we're talking about. And Marty, I wanted to raise with you a question that I think a lot of people have, a lot of consumers of the news, which is this is an odd system we seem to operate under, where reporters have protection, but the people often who give them information do not have protection. And the reporters and editors and all of us depend on those who are willing to be whistleblowers, to use the term we're talking about tonight. And I just wonder whether that system is functioning better than ever. Is it more necessary than ever? How do you define and, in a sense, explain that system?
Well, I don't know about then ever. I know I've been around a long time, but not that long. And, you know, look, I mean, I don't think that we're, as journalists, we're entirely insulated in the way that you've described. I think that a lot of this hasn't been tested. So, you know, we'll be talking about the Espionage Act, 1917, and to whom that can be applied. I think we have yet to see. But as, look, I mean, Jim Rising, who I believe is here, he was, the Justice Department was trying to force him to disclose his sources, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And he could have suffered severe consequences if the Justice Department had not dropped that case at the last, right at the very end. But he went through years of agony as a result of that. You know, the president himself has talked about, certainly in his meeting with James Comey, at least according to Comey's account, the president had said that he wanted to see some reporters go to jail. You know, he might actually like that result. So, you know, we do have quite a bit of freedom in this country, obviously going back to the First Amendment and its protections for the press, but there are protections for free expression of all types. And, you know, I think that the system is working, sometimes better, sometimes worse. And I'm not sure where it's going to end up, in this administration or thereafter. But it does seem like with each subsequent administration, there is an erosion of protections for the press.
And are we worried at the moment that some reporters may be going to jail? I mean, the president has said the press are the enemies of the people. He certainly seems to have benefited politically from the use of that rhetoric. Do we have to worry about whether some of our reporters will go to jail?
Well, I think, you know, you always worry about those sorts of things, particularly when the Attorney General announced a year ago that he had tripled the number of leak investigations. Certainly there were more prosecutions during the Obama administration. Now, some of those were carryovers of cases that were started in the previous administration, but it was a lot of prosecutions, and it was far more than all previous administrations combined. But we're in the early stages of this administration, actually. So we don't know where these leak investigations might go and who might be ensnared. But when you have a president who defines national security as broadly as he seems to be defining it, I mean, look, he's instituting tariffs on the grounds of national security. Right. He talks about people being traitors and actions being treasonous. To what extent can he try to apply those kinds of definitions to leaks to the press?
Carrie, do you think this language about national security is being used in a dangerously loose manner these days? You've worked in intelligence. You've had to defend real national security. Is national security at stake when the president can't find out who wrote an anonymous column in the New York Times, as he said it was?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack here in terms of what some of the things that Marty just said. So first, to take your first question, in terms of the president's rhetoric on national security, as someone who used to work in the national security establishment, his rhetoric is something that I'm very concerned about because he uses national security as a pretext for a whole range of policy directions that he wants to take. What I worry about from a national security perspective is that by using that as a justification for so many different policy things like immigration and also a whole host of things, revoking security clearances of former government employees, trying to investigate the individual who wrote the op-ed in the White House. What that does is that muddles legitimate national security justification when there really is a need. So yes, I'm deeply concerned about the way that he uses that justification and what it means when there's a real national security issue that we have to deal with. With respect to reporters and leaks of information in particular, and sort of the worries about whether or not reporters will be ensnared in that, I think there is a distinction between the president's rhetoric and what we are seeing in terms of actual prosecution of leak cases. There has been an uptick in leaks, both in terms of the number, but I think the more substantial observation of the last several years is in terms of the scope, and that has a lot to do with just the way that information is retained and digital information. And so a leak today of classified information or an unauthorized disclosure of classified information is far more damaging because somebody can download 1.5 million documents as opposed to walk out of the building with a few files stuffed under their, in a briefcase or whatever. So the scope is different. Interestingly, the policies of the Justice Department in terms of the actual written policies for when the Justice Department can seek information from reporters about investigations has remained relatively consistent from changes that the Obama administration made midway through their term under Attorney General Holder and to the president. To my knowledge, Attorney General Sessions and the Justice Department deputies under him, despite the intense rhetoric at the top, both from the president and from the Attorney General, the actual policies of obtaining information in investigations from journalists has remained consistent, and I hope that it stays that way.
Laura, you were very much involved in what many people regard as a major disclosure of what was widely referred to as national security information. The documents that are mostly associated with the name of Edward Snowden. What were your lessons from that? Would that happen today?
Wow, what are the lessons? I mean, I think that there are many. I mean, I think that the lessons, and I think there are lessons both for protecting sources and for journalists. In my particular circumstance, I was approached by Edward Snowden, and I'm a documentary filmmaker, and it's a bit more complicated, actually, for the work that I do than if you're working for the Post or for the New York Times. And I think that the government has tried to peel away people who are doing reporting, First Amendment protected reporting, either documentary filmmakers or people who are doing more independent reporting, from the kinds of protections that maybe you have if you're working for more establishment organizations. I mean, are there many journalism students in the room? Can I see?
There are some. Yeah.
There's some. I mean, I think that the biggest advice that I would give is that when I was approached, I actually had a lot of knowledge about digital security and source protection. And that if you're in this field, you should just assume as a baseline that you are going to be targeted, that the information that you're receiving will be targeted, and that you need to learn how to use digital security tools to be able to protect your sources, because it's not going to be enough for you just to say, I will protect my sources, because there are other ways to discover who you're talking to.
Yeah, well, a lot's changed since Daniel Ellsberg walked into the newsroom of the New York Times with a big cardboard box and said, don't tell anybody I gave it to you.
Right.
It's a pretty simple transaction compared to what goes on now. Actually, you made a point that makes me want to stress right now. I just was reading the other day that for the first time since Watergate, enrollments in journalism school are increasing, having gone down over all these years. So, Jamil, your job is to protect newspapers, mainstream media, new media. How's that going?
Well, I think the answer to that is complicated. You know, I think it is true that at the beginning of this administration, there was a lot of fear about how the administration would use these authorities, and thus far, some of those fears haven't been fully realized. We haven't seen the huge uptick in leak prosecutions. There's a lot of, very troubling rhetoric, but in many cases, that's where it has so far stopped. I don't think, though, that we should take from that the system is working, as it ought to. I think that the statements that the White House is putting out there have an inevitable and I think quite deliberate chilling effect on would-be leakers and probably on journalists too at the margins. I think people are a lot more careful about conversations with sources than they might have been 10 years ago. And I think Carrie makes a good point when she says that one difference between the landscape we're looking at now and the landscape we were looking at, say, 10 or 20 years ago is that now, with the click of a button, you can disclose tens of thousands or more documents. But there are other differences as well. One is that a lot more information is classified now. And there is, I think, universal agreement or very widespread agreement across the political spectrum that too much information is classified, that a lot of stuff is classified for the wrong reasons. And so, one of the things we need to take into account is that there may be more need for whistleblowing now than there might have been 30 or 40 years ago. And then the other thing, which is related again to the point that Carrie made, is that it's much easier for the government to track down leakers. Because the same technology that allows leakers to disclose tens of thousands of documents at once also allows the government to identify who the leakers were. And all of this, I think, it's hard to weigh all of this and figure out, well, so where does that leave us now? How much, does that mean that we have more information out there now or less? But I do think that we should worry about whether we're getting all the information we need about national security policy, whether people who have knowledge of illegal activities within the government or waste or abuse will feel comfortable coming forward with that information, or whether they're going to hesitate or more than hesitate because of the possibility and near certainty that the government will be able to identify them, and that when they're identified, they'll be prosecuted very aggressively.
We have on the panel this evening someone who doesn't like to be called a whistleblower, doesn't call himself a whistleblower, but most people think of Alberto Mora as a whistleblower for what he did during the George W. Bush administration about torture, enhanced interrogation techniques at Guantanamo, etc. Alberto, do you think that what you did would be as easily done? Perhaps first you should tell us very briefly what it is you think you did that was important.
So at the time, this would have been in 2002, I was serving as the General Counsel of the Department of the Navy. The department had no actual role in detention policy or operations, that being a combatant commander sort of function within the operational chain of command. But I oversaw the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS, and one day in November 2002, they came to me and said that their people in Guantanamo had heard rumors that detainees were being abused in Guantanamo. And I went looking for the abuse. Within 2 days, had found the memorandum from the DoD, Department of Defense General Counsel, to Secretary Rumsfeld.
Within 2 days?
Can
Within
you
2 days.
slow that down? How did you do that?
2 days. Well, there was only one person who I thought might have any knowledge of this event. I mean, literally one person in the entire military, and he was the Army General Counsel. So he was my counterpart at the Army. And Army had been given some authorities by Secretary Rumsfeld to conduct these operations. I called this individual up and said, look, Steve, his name, I'm hearing rumors of detainee abuse in Guantanamo. Do you know anything about this? And if you're an attorney, you ask these kinds of questions all the time, and the answer is always no. But on this occasion, Steve said, I know a lot about it. Come on down. And I almost dropped the phone. And then the day afterwards, I went down to his office, and he slid across the table this composite document. The bottom document was a request from Guantanamo military base commander to use what they called counter-resistance interrogation techniques. These were what we later came to know as the enhanced interrogation techniques with some minor modifications. That had gone up to Southcom in Miami, who had approved the techniques. went to the Joint Staff. The Joint Staff had not finished analyzing it, but then it was taken out by the DoD General Counsel, sent to Rumsfeld with the recommendation that he approve. Rumsfeld approved, and then below the approval, he wrote longhand, I stand on my desk from 6 to 8 hours a day. Why are they limited to stand between 2 and 4 hours a day or something of the sort? In looking at the memorandum, by the way, I thought it was a mistake, meaning these are attorneys who just didn't catch the issue, just failed to recognize the legal and policy significance of what they were proposing and authorizing. The documents clearly authorized the use of torture, either in individual techniques or cumulatively, and I got launched into this because I thought I was saving my friends, the attorneys, from making a legal mistake that would damage everybody associated with this.
So how did you get this information out? How do...
I didn't get it out. I and lots of other people in the Pentagon, including all the Judge Advocate Generals of all the services, all of us after a while came to see the issues exactly the same. All of us were working to the same direction. There was, after I threatened to write a memorandum criticizing the initial legal analysis, Secretary Rumsfeld rescinded the authorization to apply abusive techniques in Guantanamo, and NCIS confirmed to me that the abuse had stopped. Then there was another process, but we thought this had been solved. I did not receive notice that any abuse was going on anywhere in the system, including Guantanamo, until Abu Ghraib exploded 2 years later, and it became evident that what I thought was the reality, meaning a few rogue guards with a few bad commanders, bad leadership, brain fever on the part of the chain of command within the Pentagon, that wasn't the reality. The reality was, of course, a metastasis in the decision to apply torture globally, and it wasn't only localized in the Department of Defense.
Probably worth pointing out that the Abu Ghraib photographs were leaked. It was Joe Darby, an Army sergeant, who gave the documents, I think, to the New Yorker and to 60 Minutes. I'm not sure he gave them directly, but a whistleblower is why we know of, why we learned of the
That's how we began to find that out.
That's right.
Right. And just to return to you for a second, Alberto, your thought process, eventually you've been recognized as having, and I have a feeling it's not because you fooled people. I think that you really did something very significant in alerting the people to what was going on, and you've been very widely honored for that. What is the thought process that you went through that we could learn from today as we try to think about making sure the public knows about what's happening in national security?
It may sound a little bit smug, but I was an attorney doing my job. It was as simple as that. It was a clear black and white case of erroneous legal reasoning and draftsmanship. It was a failure to apply policy analysis to the proposal to use torture as a weapon of war. I had the advantage that I didn't have a career writing on my decisions or my actions, meaning that unlike the vast majority of people working in the military or in the civilian departments, my ability to pay a mortgage didn't rely on the approval of my superiors, and I wasn't risking being fired. The one thing I knew for certain going into the Navy was that that job would come to an end at some point, sooner rather than later, under circumstances beyond my control to some extent, but I was going to do the best job I can and work in that corner of issues that deal with the controversial, the political, the difficult issues for career people to handle. So for me, I was saving my colleagues, my friends, the department, the administration from committing a colossal mistake by adopting and then executing these policies. It's as simple as that.
Marty, do we have enough people in government today, as far as you can tell, who would be willing to take this kind of stand?
Well, it's hard to say exactly, but my guess is no, because there are so many people in government who are fearful of losing their jobs and not being able to pay their mortgage, and being blackballed in some fashion. So it's only natural that people are concerned about their livelihoods and providing for their families. So, people are afraid. People are afraid that they'll they'll be prosecuted. They're afraid that even if they make nowadays, I believe, if they make these arguments internally, that in some fashion they'll be blackballed, that they'll be shifted into a lower level position or pushed into some sort of obscure corner office, as we've seen in some departments. Things like that, that if you're the squeaky wheel, they're going to get rid of you in some fashion or push you aside. And so, look, I mean, I think people are concerned about, I think this was true during the Obama administration. There were lots of people who were concerned about potential prosecutions. They were just concerned about being the object of suspicion. So there were many people in government, and this has been pretty well documented, many people in government who were simply unwilling to even have an interaction with a journalist, particularly on a national security matter, because they were afraid that if there were to be a leak investigation at some later point, their communications with that journalist would make them an object of suspicion. And they then would have to hire a lawyer, they would have to defend themselves, it would be very costly, and they would pay a price in terms of their career. So they were even reluctant to sort of have these kinds of relatively normal conversations to explain policy, to provide some context and background that is helpful to journalists in actually doing their jobs.
Do we need some sort of protection in law for whistleblowers, for people who are willing to take those chances and are afraid of all the things that I think you very graphically described? Jamil, do you see any way to formulate
Yeah, I mean, I guess
protection
I should make the point that I think Carrie would make if you turn to her right now. But you know, there are some prosecutions that make sense in this context. You know, not every leaker is a whistleblower, and I'm comfortable with some leaked prosecutions. For example, you know, when somebody takes highly sensitive information and turns it over to a foreign intelligence service,
as people have done.
As people have done. That seems to me the appropriate use of the Espionage Act. The problem, from my perspective, is that the law recognizes, the only value that the law recognizes in that context is national security. And national security understood very narrowly. If you're a whistleblower, you're not permitted to argue to the court that you disclosed information because it showed government misconduct. You can't argue to the court that it was in the public interest for you to disclose this information. Those kinds of arguments are off limits, and courts have held over and over again that the Espionage Act makes those arguments off limits. And then even if you, you know, once you are convicted of having violated the Espionage Act, you can't argue at sentencing that your disclosures were in the public interest and the public interest should be taken into account in some form in that context. And that seems to me a problem. And it's a problem because it's unfair to the whistleblower, but it's more broadly, it's a problem because it ends up depriving the public of information the public needs to understand government policy and to understand the most consequential of government policies and government actions. So yes, I think that the law should reflect some form of protection for whistleblowers, and it doesn't right now.
Carrie, where would you draw that line?
Well, I mean, the espionage is an early 20th century provision, and so the disclosure, the disclosure of unauthorized information, it ends up falling under the espionage statutes, even if it's a public disclosure and it's not actual espionage. So it's a little bit counterintuitive because it falls under that statute. On one hand, it works. I mean, there have been many, you know, there have been a number of prosecutions for unauthorized disclosures that have been appropriately prosecuted using that statutory framework. On the other hand, I'm open to the argument that it's outdated and maybe there's a way that it can be modernized. I think the distinction, though, between damage is more damaging because it's provided secretly to a foreign intelligence service versus it's just as damaging because it's provided publicly. I feel like that distinction is falling away a little bit. And so I'm not sure that I would agree that it's necessarily worse if it's provided to a foreign intelligence service than it's provided publicly. I mean, the damaging leaks that we are seeing are public now. Everything is in public. Things that we would have used to have seen, if you take the Russian influence intelligence activities that in decades ago we would have thought to have been occurring secretly are occurring openly. And that's just sort of the period of time that we are in right now.
Is that better or worse?
Whatever reason. From a perspective of whether or not it's harmful to the underlying national security activity, it's sort of, it could be irrelevant. I mean, it would factor into the analysis of how damaging it is, but the definition of classified information is that it causes damage to the national security or grave damage to the national security, depending on how high the information is classified. So that damage assessment can be done whether or not the information is provided secretly or whether the information is publicly. If a sensitive intelligence program is revealed publicly, that potentially could be very damaging to national security. So I'm just not quite sure that that is where the difference is. As a practical matter, I don't see sort of politically anything on the horizon right now that will see us have a meaningful policy debate over the Espionage Act, though.
It doesn't sound like Laura.
I'm just going to disagree. I mean, and I also just want to bring it back to the sort of subtext of the issues that we're talking about. And what you're talking about is legalization of torture. Like the public, this is a moral issue, it's an outrage, it's a war crime, and the public should know about it. And so I think that this is not something, and the administration would have argued that it was part of national security, and I just think we have to look at like what are the underlying, what is being done in our name, and what should the public know about. I think mass surveillance at a global level it is something the public should know about, and I think that the fact that people had to put their own freedom on the line to educate us is a problem with the system, that we shouldn't have this.
Well, just to make one distinction there. So, of course, First Amendment, the press can publish this information, right? So I don't think there's any serious policy debate over whether or not this information can be published, and we see that through, I think for the most part, I mean, Marty, maybe you've had specific instances where the government can make an argument, but I think as a matter of most people in this policy space understand that the press has a First Amendment right to publish information. The punishment and the investigation and the responsibility under the justice system falls on the individual who was in the position of trust. So there is a big distinction between the individual who works for the government, who has in a position of trust, has access to the classified information and reveals it publicly. That person is treated under the justice system very differently than how we would evaluate the media's role in that.
Yeah, I think the question is why? Why should we deny whistleblowers the protection we give to the press in those instances in which the disclosures are in the public interest? And obviously there's going to be a question in some cases about whether the disclosures were in the public interest or not, and somebody's going to have to make that decision, and it can't be the whistleblower. It's got to be somebody independent of the whistleblower. But it doesn't seem obvious to me that the system we all take for granted right now, which gives the press a certain amount of protection, although I think Marty's right that we shouldn't take that for granted, but gives the press a certain amount of protection, at least as a matter of custom, but denies it to whistleblowers, is defensible. Doesn't seem defensible to me.
A lot of our modern thought about this issue of national security disclosures does come from the Pentagon Papers case, where there was reason to believe that a person, Daniel Ellsberg, was going to go to prison for the rest of his life for revealing documents that no one could show did any damage to national security whatsoever. I mean, even the Solicitor General, Erwin Griswold, who argued that they did, later wrote an op-ed piece saying he never believed it when he made that argument. So I think certainly people in the media and a lot of members of the public are very skeptical about these claims of national security.
Well, I mean, I think they should be. I mean, so many things are classified. I mean, there's an enormous overclassification. I mean, there are millions of people who can make these decisions, and they make, hundreds of millions of decisions on what becomes classified. There are even cases where actual newspaper stories have been later classified, and they were already published in the newspaper. And so it gets to the point of absurdity. I mean, and that's not to say that...
That was the case in the Pentagon Papers.
Right, that's not to say that nothing should be classified, but when somebody says they leaked classified information, it sounds like it must be like horrible and is a threat to national security. But in many instances, it's not a threat to national security, and there are many instances where, you know, this president and previous presidents have cited national security, and there's no real evident risk to national security. What's at risk is the reputation of the politicians involved, the president involved, and his administration, and they fear risk of embarrassment is what they fear. And that's not to say that there aren't, you know, instances where there are real substantive issues, but in many instances it's a matter of embarrassment. So.
And there's also a risk to national security from over secrecy internal to the administration. Internal to the administration. If you look at the Bush administration's legal policies during the early years of the War on Terror, and a lot of the other policies as well, part of the problem was that those decisions were kept to too small a circle. So those decisions and the issues didn't get the searching scrutiny that might have been received even a little more broadly. For example, the State Department, legal advisors, Colin Powell, did not know the basis for the suspension of the Geneva Convention, which was the necessary prerequisite to the adoption of a torture policy. The JAGs, the military experts on the laws of war and how they apply to combat operations, were not included at all in any of those decisions, including military commissions or again, the interrogation policies. It weakened the decision. It contributed to the failure, policy failure, and legal failure of those ultimate decisions.
Can anyone imagine, I mean, Alberto and Carrie, you've both served in the government. Can you ever imagine a time when people would be receiving awards for not classifying information, for declassifying information, for making the public's business known to the public? I mean, is that just too ridiculous to mention?
It's too ridiculous to mention. Just, you know,
Carrie, can you imagine that? I mean, a real program to encourage.
Well, we are in an era of, Jamil, I'll be curious what you think about this. We are in an era of pretty robust use of the Freedom of Information Act in a way that when I was in government, it was not used. So I think that journalists and other advocates are using that quite effectively, more than I would have thought in the past. Lately, certainly I don't think anyone in this policy space disagrees that the classification system generally is you know, sort of begging for modernization, so I don't quibble with that. I think one of the issues that the national security policy community is struggling with in the environment of these mass leaks of classified information is the breakdown in the oversight system that has been in place for several decades. So in the late 1970s, after the Church investigation and after a lot of surveillance abuses were revealed, there was more of an oversight structure put in place. In particular, intelligence committees in Congress established to conduct oversight over lots of these activities. And I think one of the surprising things to the national security community after some of the mass disclosures was that the public didn't really take confidence in the fact that members of Congress functioning in this system, actually the way it was basically designed, it didn't provide the public confidence that those on the inside thought that it would. And so that's an area where I think from a policy perspective, we really need to do more work to think about what are more effective oversight mechanisms that actually will provide public confidence, because I think the model that we've been using for several decades just seems to be somewhat outdated.
Well, even the Freedom of Information Act is more than 50 years old now. It's half as old as the Espionage Act, and it could use a little bit of broadening and liberalizing, it seems to me. But
yeah, I mean, it's not that easy to use it. I mean, certainly we use it as energetically as we possibly can, but it can take a long time to get information. It can be quite expensive. The government often resists. They basically challenge us to take them to court, and many times we have to do that. And so it's not as if you file a Freedom of Information Act request and, you know, a week later, here comes the information on a national security matter. It just doesn't work that way. It is a laborious process. You often have to fight with the government. You often don't get what you want. If you get something, it may be heavily redacted to the point where like a huge percentage of the actual document has, you know, black marks through it, and you can't read it. So it's just not an easy process.
Hence the need for whistleblowers and leakers to ride to the rescue and make this information available.
I think if anything, Marty overstates the effectiveness of the freedom of at least in the national security sphere. I think that it's you know, not just laborious and a laborious process, but you know, it very rarely leads to the disclosure of information. You can count on one hand the number of times a court has overturned the executive branch's classification decision. If the executive branch walks into court and says, this is classified for national security reasons, in almost every case, that's the end.
And I was just talking about FOIAs across the board,
generally,
whether they involve national security or not. Even when they don't involve national security, it's
That's
incredibly
right.
difficult. With national security, you're absolutely right. It's almost impossible.
So if we're talking about free speech and public information about national security, what should we be trying to do? Laura, should we be finding a method to encourage more whistleblowers? Is Edward Snowden's life in Russia a model of what people might have to face?
I mean, I'm actually wanted to ask you a question. When you first saw these memos, did you think to yourself to go to the press? Is it something?
No.
No?
Didn't cross my mind.
Why not?
Because I thought it was a mistake that I was going to solve by pointing out the flaws in the reasoning. And then we thought we had won.
And when did you realize that wasn't what was happening?
After Abu Ghraib, when it became clear that it wasn't just limited to the Pentagon. CIA, White House, Department of Justice was involved, and those disclosures leaked out over time. It wasn't all at once. So, for example, when Rumsfeld first indicated that Abu Ghraib was just the bottom of the barrel, I thought that was plausible at first. I wondered whether there was a failure of leadership and whether the efforts we had made had failed in some respect, but that was a plausible explanation at first for what happened.
I don't know, Marty,
It's more confidence in government than I think we do.
I should mention, Sandy, something else in the vein of your question. We need to take a look at the congressional failure in terms of oversight, because I think most people would agree that Congress has failed spectacularly in exercising its oversight function in a lot of these national security cases. And obviously, ethical behavior, legal behavior in government agencies is the first line of defense. But after that, it comes pretty closely the Congress and the oversight mechanism, and it's not as effective, not as capable, and there's not as much of a will, particularly to investigate your own party, than perhaps there used to be some years back.
I mean, I want to answer your question. I don't think we should sit here and ask other people to risk their freedom. I mean, I actually do think it's the job of the press to ask tough questions and to make us try to confront or demand more information from the government. I think it's as much a burden of the press and the public to demand that the government tell us what it's doing in our name.
But to bring it down to one recent example, Edward Snowden has become a controversial figure in some ways. Not everyone admires him. There have been arguments in magazines in many places. But his example does not seem to me to stand out as something that would encourage other people to do the same thing he did, the life he's living now. Is that a correct assertion on my part?
I mean, I'm not sure that actually is...
Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I would agree with that. I think that he did something that he felt morally obligated to do, and he explained to the world why he did it. And it has changed how people understand the digital age in which we live. I think it's shifted consciousness. So I think those are things that he would defend, and I think for others who are witnessing wrongdoing in the government.
Can you imagine a day when he'll be able to come home? When
Actually, I do. Yeah.
You do. Others think that'll happen?
You know,
He's
his
young.
disclosures
Could happen.
have led to significant legal reforms. You know, the European Court of Human Rights has ruled that certain surveillance programs that he disclosed were unlawful. The Second Circuit here ruled that the NSA's call records program was unlawful. Congress passed a law to end that particular version of the program, at least. So there's certainly room for disagreement about whether he went about things the right way. I personally don't think he had other options. But I think it's pretty clear that his disclosures, really did change the political and legal landscape. So, I think that's what he set out to do, and I imagine if you asked him whether he would do it again, he would probably say yes.
I'm going to welcome questions from the audience. We'll have a microphone in the center aisle here, and I'd like to suggest that Georgetown students and other students have the first priority to ask questions. We're here at their university and for their education. So anybody who has questions, please come to the microphone in the center aisle. Carrie, if you think about changes, I mean, there must be a lot of, I imagine from this conversation, there must be a lot of reluctant whistleblowers in the government. People, I mean, what we've all heard described, how sources are afraid, people afraid to come forward. How would you, having worked in the intelligence community, try to fix that? Get the information that has to come out through government sources to come out without damaging information coming out?
Well, as I mentioned before, I think one of the areas is that we need to rethink the oversight system so that there is a more effective channel for people to be able to raise concerns based on the public reporting regarding Snowden, for example. I've never been convinced that he really went through those channels. Of course, there may have been more that took place behind the scenes that has not been revealed publicly. But according to the public record, I've never really seen much effort. But I do think that congressional intelligence oversight is an area where we really need to pay some attention so that there is more of a sense and an understanding on the public's part that there is this proxy within the representative government that is paying attention and can actually do something about it. One of the challenges, of course, for members who sit on those committees is that they might receive information, but then they are bound from being able to discuss it with their colleagues who are not on the committee. So one of the things that I would like to see is more effort, and we would have to sort of develop the framework for this, for members who are not on these committees of expertise to have a better understanding of what goes on in the national security space, particularly so that when meaningful legislation comes up, they are not in a position of just having to rely on whatever talking points are sort of thrown their way. So I think we need a deeper understanding. The other piece is with respect to transparency. The intelligence community has done a lot since, in particular, the Snowden disclosures, to institutionally try to reveal more information publicly about how the laws are implemented and the policies that are in place. Where I think we need to still see more work done is the intelligence community being more transparent about what it's actually learning and doing a better job of informing the public about the threats. But we've got a pretty big line.
Yes, we do have some people in line for questions. If you'll ask, tell us who you are and ask a brief question, we'll appreciate it.
Hank Wallace of Write and Speak Like the News. Editor Barron, do you ever hold a story, a spotlight-like story even, in order to get still more leaks, lest the leaker be tracked down and shut down?
Look, I mean, if we have a story that's ready to publish, we publish that story. I mean, we don't hold a story with the hope that somebody else will emerge or that we'll get somebody. We basically try to get all of the sourcing we need in order to publish the story that we have in front of us. And then there's a story the next day, we would hope, and that we would follow it up. The reality is that publishing a story actually causes other people frequently to come forward and provide us information.
Next question.
Hi, I'm a student in the college. My question is just basically for everybody in general. I was wondering about how we've been going back and forth a little bit about like whether or not there should be whistleblowers, the advantages and the benefits. I was wondering how whistleblowers coming out of the U.S., how that works for national security within the international arena and how that makes us look. If there's been an uptick in national security breaches and whistleblowers, and if that trend continues, then about just the U.S. in the international arena?
That's an interesting question. Who wants to take that, Alberto?
Well, as a former Foreign Service officer, my first reaction at the Bradley Manning or Chelsea Manning disclosures was dismay, because it seemed to be just an undifferentiated and undiscriminating release of massive documents. And sure, there was some valuable information that the public would have wished to have known or was useful to have known. But for example, when you disclose in the dump, as Manning did, the names of human rights activists in difficult countries who came to the embassy to share their views about the human rights situation, that's putting literally those individuals' lives at risk.
But I think it's important to make a distinction between the publication. What did the publisher decide to do? That was actually the disclosure was made by the publisher in that case, and as also in the case of Snowden, it's the publishers that are. I mean, they're receiving the information.
Yeah.
The information is leaked, and I think that probably, if you look at the sort of in terms of reporting out, there are certain things that I would argue, of course, you withhold, that's not in the public interest, but that in the documents being able to sort of look at a picture of, for instance, the occupation of Iraq or Afghanistan is very important. Would I reveal the name of sources? I wouldn't, but I do think being able to look at how the U.S. military is engaging in its foreign policy is valuable in public interest.
Anyone else on that? Let's go to the next question.
Hi, my name is Tom Neer. I'm a retired FBI agent who was at Guantanamo in 2002. I was among many FBI agents.
You should be up here.
I was among many FBI agents who did report the abuses going on. That's a matter of record. But we went through the chain of command. So to answer your question, no, I would not have gone to the press. I believe enough in our system to go through channels. So my question to the panel is, my understanding, at least from what's been published so far, is that Snowden did not avail himself of any of the whistleblower statutes. And I was just wondering what your comments were about that.
Laura?
I mean, I don't want to sort of make the panel about that question. I mean, I guess I would put the question back. Did the channels work? I mean, Guantanamo's still open, and nobody's been held accountable, as far as I know, for any act of torture. So did the channels work? Would be a question.
Well, it remains to be seen. I mean, I think I certainly was interviewed by various congressional panels, and as far as I'm concerned, the system has worked. It may not have worked in a timely fashion, but I think the question I would throw back to you...
But what accountability
the question
has
I would
there
throw
been?
back to you is, at what point does somebody get to make a decision, a unilateral decision, to leak something, and then we call them a whistleblower when they didn't even avail themselves of a statute called the whistleblower statute?
Well,
That's my question.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wouldn't get hung up on terminology like it's a whistleblower, it's a source, it's a leaker, what have you. But, Laura referred earlier to Snowden feeling that he had a moral obligation to make this information available. He evidently had come to the conclusion that had he gone through channels, it would have gone nowhere. Now you can agree with that or disagree with that, what have you. But ultimately, people make decisions based on their sense of their own moral code as well. And there are many instances where if people went through channels, they would be confident, I think correctly, that it would not actually result in any action. And so at that point, some people come forward and provide information to the press, and they feel that their sense of what's right, their moral code dictates that they should do that. And they run the risk, obviously, of potential prosecution.
Two quick things. One is that national security whistleblowers have almost no protection under statute in the United States. There are whistleblower protections for non-national security leaks, but not for national security whistleblowers. It's interesting that I know a little bit about the FBI emails that you wrote, because I was involved in a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit in 2003 that resulted in the public disclosure of those emails in December of 2004. And it wasn't until those emails were disclosed publicly that Congress actually started paying any attention to the issue of detainee mistreatment at Guantanamo. All that stuff, I mean, it was great that there was a record that FBI agents at Guantanamo had made a record of the abuse that they had witnessed at Guantanamo. But it wasn't until that stuff was made public that Congress started to pay attention. I said earlier that the Freedom of Information Act very rarely works. This was one instance in which it did work, and it worked because the FBI disagreed with the policies of the CIA and the Defense Department. And when we filed the Freedom of Information Act, we filed it with multiple agencies, and the CIA and the Defense Department stonewalled us. They didn't want to release anything. And the FBI wanted to make clear that it didn't have anything to do with the torture that was going on at Guantanamo. So it's because of institutional competition between the FBI and the CIA and the DOD that those emails came to light, and it was because those emails came to light that we had the first meaningful congressional debate about abuse at Guantanamo.
I just want to add one thing, maybe a more satisfying answer than asking you a question back, but I think you also have to look at the historical context and what else had happened with other people who'd spoken to the press. And so when Edward Snowden was making his decision, it was also in the context of the investigation into Thomas Drake, who tried to expose waste and wrongdoing, and there was the NSA-4, that they went into homes of people who had used the proper channels. So he sort of looked at that landscape, I think, in making his decision.
I'll point out the case of Captain Ian Fishback, the 82nd Airborne officer who, after 17 months of trying to get clear legal guidance on what the military rule on the abuse of prisoners was, decided to write a letter to Senator John McCain. John McCain published his letter 2 weeks later and then introduced the McCain Act, which prohibited the application of cruelty across the government all over the world. Ian Fishback went through the channels, but he was frustrated by lack of response, and then he went public with his information. An example of a highly successful whistleblower trying but being frustrated at the lack of response from the chain of command.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi everyone, my name is Josh Weiner. I'm a graduate student here. I was interested in the point brought up towards the beginning about how for the first time in years there's actually more students attending journalism school than before. So can I just ask the panel, what do you think are some of the factors behind this rate, and also what do you think the effect of the industry will be if there are more and more students getting journalism degrees and qualifications?
Marty?
I'm not sure it's terribly relevant to this panel, but just quickly, look, I mean, I think that people are inspired by some of the journalism they're seeing. They believe that their government should be held accountable. They see that the press and the mainstream press is doing a good job, in their view, of holding their government accountable. And they feel a sense of mission themselves. They identify with the sense of mission of journalism, and they're inspired to go into journalism school, to go to journalism schools as a result of that. What will the consequence be? I hope it's not just more unemployment, and I don't think it will be. I think that, you know, our field is being reinvented quite rapidly, and people are being trained for the new environment as it currently exists, and so I think there will be opportunities for them, and they're the kind of people we would like to have in our profession.
And some of us still read our print edition of the Washington Post
and
every
we love
morning.
You, and we love you for it, so there you go.
Next.
Well, the panel has talked a lot about...
Could you tell us who you are, please?
I'm Mike Snow, journalist. The panel has talked a lot about public interest and national interest, but it seems to me a lot of people agree that the press has become so corporatized in its orientation that real stories that concern real people are not getting out or being diminished. What can you do to enhance that? We've gotten to the point where a former president, Jimmy Carter, calls us not a democracy, but an oligarchy. That's pretty serious stuff. And it seems to me that the press, to a large extent, is responsible for that, for not telling the whole truth about a lot of things to the American people. And being differential to corporate interests, not reporting the full extent of these wars that we're involved with all over the world now? There's a lot of missing things that are not relayed to the American people.
At the risk of Marty Barron being put on the spot to defend the entire press for this whole time, as the other sort of journalist on the panel, I would say that I don't think you're right. That I think we've learned so much more, and that we are in an era of great ventilation of problems, not taking politicians' words for the reality of life in this country, not depending on Congress to find out what's wrong, but moving ahead, depending on young people who are taking matters in their own hands, and depending on the media to tell those stories. There'll never be enough. The press will never do a perfect job, but I think this is a glory moment for the American media myself.
Well, we could have a debate about that, but this is in the forum for that.
Yes.
Hello. Thank you all for being here tonight. My name is Nathan Bergen. I'm a sophomore in the School of Nursing and Health Studies. My question is, there's been some debate tonight about the appropriate legal protections for whistleblowers. In circumstances where the information disclosed is a detriment to national security, what party decides, or what party should decide whether it's appropriate to disclose it, whether it's appropriate to publish it? And then to piggyback on that, with the number of methods, particularly we're seeing today, to circumvent the press, if the whistleblower, the leaker, is so determined, what prevents leaks without legal consequences from becoming commonplace?
Who wants to take that?
Carrie does.
Where should I start with that? Well, I think in terms of, one of the issues that we've been talking about in terms of who decides what's in the public interest. If you were to ask somebody in the national security community who should make that decision, information is classified because it is deemed that if it were released, it would cause damage to the national security. Under the executive branch, there's a director of national intelligence who can make declassification decisions based on public interest, and I worked for directors of national intelligence who in certain circumstances made decisions like that. And in recent years, in part prompted by unauthorized disclosures, certainly, directors of national intelligence in the last several years have been much more forward-leaning in terms of declassifying information that they deem is in the public interest, whether it's court opinions from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court or other policy documents. Again, recognizing that part of what has pushed that new transparency environment is reaction to the unauthorized disclosures themselves. And then, of course, above the D&I, the president is the ultimate decision maker when it comes to classified information. It's very difficult for people in the national security community to accept that one individual who may not understand the full landscape of the scope of the activities or the legal basis would take it upon themselves to make those decisions. And that's where we see a tension, and that's why we need to do a better job of having avenues for those individuals to go through. The other development in the last several years has been that inspector generals within the intelligence communities have been beefed up, so there's now an intelligence community-wide inspector general, and we'll see if those channels work. I suspect most of my other panelists are probably pretty skeptical that those systems will be effective, but there have been institutional changes that are trying to do that, and I do think there's more that can be done.
Yeah, actually, I would add to that the work of the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan has done a remarkable job in exposing fraud, waste, and abuse in the theater. And also, it occurs to me to point out the effect of the embedded reporters in Gulf War I, where you had reporters from all the major newspapers accompanying combat forces on the front line, and it remarkably contributed to American understanding of how the war was being fought.
I guess I have one comment on Carrie's point. I mean, I agree with Carrie that it doesn't make sense to let individual government employees decide for themselves, without any review, what information should be released. We have a system that is designed with a set of checks and balances within the executive branch, and you want that system to be allowed to operate, and you don't want individual actors to be able to override it. All that makes sense to me, but it doesn't make sense to me that we put all of this, we invest all of our trust in the executive branch alone. It seems to me that there's a role for the courts here too, And the obvious role for the courts, in my view, is in the context of individual prosecutions, a judge could find that a particular disclosure served the public interest and served it to such an extent that whatever national security cost the government may legitimately point to was overcome by the public interest. And you could deal with that at the liability stage or at the sentencing stage, but at some point, somebody outside the executive branch should make the decision of whether the disclosure was justified or not. And I think even if you were, inclined, you would have been inclined to disagree with me about that 2 years ago. If you follow the president's Twitter account, surely you now agree with me, because the president, routinely invokes national security for for reasons that are transparently have nothing to do with national security. And if you're going to put all your trust in the executive branch, and you're going to say to the other branches that this is for the executive branch alone to decide, what you're really saying is that President Trump gets to decide what national security means, and nobody else gets to second guess him. And I don't see how you can defend that now.
Can you?
Well, as I said at the outset, I take grave issue with this particular president's use of the invocation of national security, and in particular, the disclosures of information that he and his allies on the House Intelligence Committee are making. There is information that is being disclosed, particularly with the Carter Page FISAs and other intelligence information that is clearly being politicized. That is not the way the system is supposed to work. For those who have spent careers in the national security community, to see intelligence information politicized in this way is deeply disturbing. And so it certainly does raise a lot of questions about that authority of the president. And one potential consequence, if in fact the courts do end up stepping up into some sort of role, or if Congress steps up into some sort of role, is that the president that so strongly toots executive branch authority will leave the presidency much weaker than where he found it.
Thank you.
Can't decide if that's good or bad.
Is that good or bad?
Yeah. Next question.
Elise Anderson, master's student. My question is, although certain anti-retaliation provisions to protect whistleblowers do exist, when a whistleblower, by actual definition of the word, has taken action to report something illegal in their workplace and their immediate chain of command ends up turning against them, what measures can be taken to alleviate the fact that they must now potentially daily enter a hostile work environment? The option of contacting OSHA to help them often does not restore or remove them quickly enough from the personally harmful setting that they or their families now find themselves in. What do you think?
I think that's really true. I mean, that fits the profile of the average whistleblower, and what happens to that person when the fact that he blew the whistle becomes known by the workplace and its chain of command. That's, I think, more than 60% are ostracized, and a large number of whistleblowers are forced to leave the agency, ultimately, after having gone through the experience.
So it's understandable that some people would be very reluctant to do this.
Is there, I mean, there are these provisions that exist. Can anything be done, on the ground level to help them or to alleviate their problems in the workplace?
It's a matter of leadership in the agency. If the agency leadership clearly stands behind the principle that principal whistleblowing is to be encouraged because it makes the agency stronger, healthier, then that message will get down below. That frequently happens in corporate America, by the way, where a very strong signal is sent by the top leadership to protect individuals reporting improper activity. But I don't think that happens often enough in the government.
There's a larger, I think, a larger version of this problem too. Which is probably the thing that troubles me most about the era that Alberto was talking about earlier, the era of torturing prisoners at Guantanamo and elsewhere. When we came out of that era, when the Obama administration disavowed torture and rescinded the torture memos, There was an opportunity then to honor all of the people like Alberto who said no to torture and who resisted torture within the administration or from the military, and there were people in the CIA who complained to the Inspector General about these policies. And all those people, in my view, we ought to have honored in some official way, given them the Medal of Honor or some equivalent. And instead, what happened was the people who were the architects of those policies, the torture policies, were appointed to higher government posts, and the people who complained about torture from the inside, the people who put their careers and in some cases their safety on the line, were allowed to disappear into obscurity. Doesn't describe Alberto's position, but it does describe the position of some of the people who complained. And I think that is a collective failure on our part. And it's not possible that we could rectify that under this administration, but maybe at some point in the future we could do that.
Next question.
Thank you. Hello, thank you all for being here. My name is Alexandra Bowman, and I'm a freshman in the college. I have a question for all of you, but especially Ms. Poitras. Especially in light of the panel's conversation about different moral codes, has the release of classified information by Snowden and others put American lives at risk or led to the deaths of others?
Not that's been reported.
Yeah, I mean, the government has been asked to, there were some senior government officials who suggested at various points that Snowden's disclosures had led to incidents of that kind where individuals were actually endangered or in some cases killed. But when pressed to disclose more information about those instances, they didn't. And I suppose in theory it's possible that there's some classified information out there that makes clear that Snowden's disclosures were responsible for those kinds of costs. But if that information is out there, it hasn't been released.
Yeah, and I'd also just emphasize again that he shared the information with journalists, and those organizations then made the decision about what to release. So the decisions that were made by the Washington Post, the Guardian, the New York Times, Der Spiegel. I mean,
but in terms of him as an individual and utilitarianism issues, what responsibility did Snowden hold in that circumstance?
He entrusted journalists to make those decisions. I mean, about what to publish.
I think what's important to point out that he didn't just provide all that information to WikiLeaks and have it all just go up. He first contacted Laura. Laura contacted us and the Guardian, and he trusted us to use our judgment. We had experienced journalists, as did the Guardian, working on these stories. We were in constant communication, for example, with the intelligence agencies about what we intended to publish. We sat there sometimes for hours, disclosing point by point what would be in that story. We gave them opportunities to object to specific things. We never withheld a story or withheld the thrust of a story, but there were instances where there were details that they asked us to withhold because they felt that it could put at risk an individual or some method that was critical. And we took that under advisement and in some instances, in many instances, withheld that, particularly if they said that anybody's individual's life would be at risk. We definitely withheld that. So there were times they actually asked us to withhold things that had already actually been published, and we felt that we probably didn't need to do that. And yet they continued to argue that we should withhold that information because they said their supposition is that others, foreign countries that were deemed to be enemies of the United States, had not actually read that material. But in any event, that's not an instance where we would withhold information that had already been published and was widely disseminated. But when it came to the individuals' lives, we certainly respected that. And I'm not aware of any individual who has lost a life because of the material that was published. And as Jamil pointed out, nobody's been able to identify anybody.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, so this is a question for
Your name, please.
Oh, my name is Jake Levin. I'm a freshman in the college. And this is a question for all of you on the panel. I'm not going to tell you what your expertise is. So returning to a theme that's been alluded to several times, is the Congress kind of abandoning its oversight role, especially, owing to increased partisanship or reluctance to investigate one's own party, to hold them accountable. Partisanship which is not showing any signs of abating anytime soon. And so, and it's also been alluded to the limitations of executive oversight, the weakness of inspector generals, and inherently the flawed nature of the executive branch monitoring itself. So what kind of oversight structures, given that I think the consensus seems to be that the status quo is not effective, what kind of oversight structures would those on the panel see as potentially necessary, as we enter, an era of where we seem to be in some peril in this area?
That's a fair question. Are there some oversight procedures that we think people could agree upon and put into place?
Well,
Carrie?
well, one area on Congress is, I think we really need to take a look, and this is some of the policy-related work that I do, is take a look at rethinking the congressional intelligence oversight system and whether or not it's effective. We see real differences in today's environment versus the work that the Senate Intelligence Committee, which seems to be doing a relatively serious investigation in a bipartisan way as much as they can on investigation into Russian influence, and then we see the dysfunction and hyper-partisanship on the House side. And so I think there's a question about whether or not there's more work that can be done. And then Jamil's also raised the issue of the courts and whether or not there's more of a role there. And then I think that we also, in terms of the transparency efforts that have taken place, I don't think there's any going back. So the intelligence community has moved a certain point. They've moved the needle forward on transparency in terms of, and what I mean by that is information that they're providing to the public in an institutionalized way, where they're actually moving towards trying to make more information public, not through leaks, but through an actual analysis that they go through and trying to push information out. I don't think there's any going backwards from that. I think there's only moving forwards, and so the question is, how do we move forward on that?
Okay,
thank you. Hi, my name is Grace Ring. I'm a sophomore in the college. And my question is, as we've sort of entered an era where techniques for cyber attack have almost been outpacing the reflexive cybersecurity techniques for defense, how has the atmosphere changed surrounding, leaks that can possibly come from places without ever having to enter a government building? And as an appendum to that, what's sort of the difference in how, we'll say, leakers or whistleblowers from inside government agencies are perceived versus, we'll say, like white hat hackers or, accessing that information and leaking it through external groups?
Let's take that.
So I'll make one quick point and then let others think of how they want to respond to. So one quick point goes to, you mentioned sort of how information is accessed, and obviously now we're in a new era where information can be accessed through potentially hacking, for lack of a non-technical way to put it. I do think that there's a substantial question that the national security community needs to wrestle with, which is that can they continue to conduct certain activities and collect certain information and develop certain cyber tools if they can't protect them? And that is a major challenge that I'm not sure is being wrestled with in the way that it needs to be.
Or discussed candidly.
Yeah.
I think that, I agree with that. There's also the fact that so many private corporations now have access to, whenever we're online, we're sharing our most sensitive information with private corporations, and those private corporations hoard that information. And I don't think we have fully grappled yet with the vulnerability that's created by those companies' stores of information. And I think inevitably we're going to see over the next few years different kinds of bad actors hacking into those kinds of stores of information and disclosing that kind of information about private citizens. And I think the way most of us anyway think about cyber threats doesn't yet account for that, that particular fact pattern.
Laura, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'm going to agree with Carrie on the defense point that the vast resources that are used to exploit or to exploit other entities, governments, or its corporations, and the need for the NSA and other intelligence organizations to really think about security, the security of the information that they have, security of critical infrastructure, et cetera.
We're going to take the last 3 questions of people standing. And then we'll give everyone I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry. The other 3 people, if you could state your questions, we'll give everyone one last chance to answer them and make concluding remarks. Please.
Hi, I'm Malin Fiddler. I'm a law student, and my question is mainly for Laura. I know today's conversation focuses on national security, but I think some of those concerns about whistleblowers translate to whistleblowers who reveal details that are sort of more domestically related, whether with law enforcement. What does the landscape look like for them in terms of their relationship with the press and the risks that they face?
I mean, I think I understand your question. So outside of the national security context, I mean, I work with documentary filmmakers, and they're sort of on the front line of doing this kind of reporting. I just worked on a film which is about New York Police Department and their use of quotas in arresting people. And the filmmaker was following several police officers who resisted this. They became whistleblowers. And there was great retaliation, and there was a lot of questions around how to tell the story. The filmmaker ultimately ended up using hidden cameras at some point to actually be able to have evidence of how the police department was engaging in the use of quotas. So I think that there are like threats of retaliation. I mean, the retaliation against the people who come forward to draw attention, the whistleblowers in this case, and to the people who report it, the filmmakers. So, or if you look at something like Black Lives Matters and the organizers and activists who are out on the front lines, I mean, they're being absolutely targeted by police departments in terms of collecting their personal information and creating profiles about them. So I do think that there is, that there are a lot of risks in exposing this kind of, whatever, power, and not just at the national security level.
I guess we'll take them one at a time after all. Yes.
Hi, my name is Aida. I'm a freshman in the college. My question is regarding public perception in the media. So it was mentioned earlier that there's a distinction between the president's rhetoric and the actual retaining and disclosure of information. But the shortening of the news cycle has definitely impacted the circulation of media, and the president does take the spotlight in a lot of those cases. So how does the panel believe that the president's rhetoric has impacted the circulation of information brought to attention by whistleblowers and leakers, and how has the media kind of adapted to the change in public perception because of that?
Well, he's helped. I mean, he's the more that he tweets about it, he talks about it. He helps. He drives people to the stories in the first place. I mean, it's a sort of an odd thing. He's obviously boosted the traffic overall that people get. He's boosted ratings for broadcasting. He's certainly right about that. That he's had that kind of impact. I mean, I think obviously the concern is the rhetoric that he is using. And how he, as we've talked about already, is portraying many of these things as being, first of all, is describing them as being fake news or lies, saying that frequently, that quite often, that when you see anonymous sources, that means they have no sources. One of my favorite instances of that is when we reported that his initial national security advisor, Michael Flynn, General Michael Flynn, had conversations with the Russian ambassador about the lifting of sanctions prior to the administration taking office, that and Flynn had denied that, we reported that in fact he had those conversations. He had talked about the lifting of sanctions, had spoken to the Russian ambassador. And subsequent to that, the president gave a speech in which he said that, they say they have 9 sources, which is what we reported, because we did have 9 sources. And he said, they say they have 9 sources, they have no sources. And just immediately after saying that we had no sources, he then called for a leak investigation. So now I don't know how you reconcile the two, because if we had no sources, what exactly is he investigating? And not only that, he then followed that up subsequent to that by firing General Flynn on the grounds that he had lied about his conversations, had lied to the President of the United States, and more seriously in my view, lied to the American public about that. And this was the very same story that he said was untrue and was based on no sources whatsoever. So this is what we're dealing with. It's kind of it's a very weird environment, and but in that sense, he helped circulate this, certainly helped circulate the story that we had in the first place, and we're grateful for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hello, so my name is Niall and I'm a freshman in the college, and I'm curious in regards to overclassification and the regulation of information on a federal level, to what extent should I as a private citizen have faith that when my government acts, it's actually acting in my best interest? Or should my relationship with this institution be at the best of times cautious and at the worst of times adversarial?
The latter.
What a great last question. Who wants to answer it?
I think you should restate it as a comment, because it is a good close for this panel. Yeah.
Well, maybe Jamil and Carrie could talk about this, but if you actually look at the founding of the country, there was a deep suspicion of government in the founding of the country. And what James Madison said in crafting the First Amendment is that the press was there to examine public characters and measures, and that's what we're supposed to do, and that the public is supposed to be a check on government. The reason that we have a First Amendment, it's not just a guarantee of a free press, but free expression for all of us. And there was a deep suspicion of government power at the time of the founding of the country. And that's something that has stayed with us over a period of time, and I think there are plenty of reasons to be suspicious, not with everything the government does, but certainly we should always be skeptical, we should always be on guard, and we should all be active citizens.
Well, on that note, first I want to mention that there's a reception downstairs in the 2nd floor hallway of Healy Hall, so I hope you'll join us. I want to thank all the people who helped bring this program together and help pay for it. I also just want to close by noting this is a very challenging subject, and I realized that as we were going on, and I want to thank you all for rising to the occasion. Thanks very much.